Welcome back. How might the economic policies of the two major presidential candidates affect investors? Joining us live in studio to discuss is CEO of Hard Asset Management, Christian Briggs. He's also the host of the Hard Asset Money Show. Christian, it's great to have you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you both for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Christian, so one of the things that's making waves right now is Kamala Harris's idea of unrealized capital gains tax on people who have a net worth of $100 million or more. I'm wondering, how do you think this will impact the average investor out there?
Well, it's a great question. So we got to go back to where the beginning of this tax originated from and where she's basing all of her understanding of how she can do this. The real tax was incorporated in a 2017 piece of legislation that Donald Trump, at the time, wanted to repatriate about $3 trillion worth of the Dells, the Microsofts, the Googles, offshore profits, which was a great idea. So there would be a one-time tax at a substantially lower rate than what at the current time would have otherwise been paid on. So he got their legislation, bipartisan support, big support, and he was able to pass this legislation that allowed the repatriate of about $3 trillion, which it worked. It was a great plan. Lo and behold, there was one person that was sent in a bill for about a $10,000 tax because the IRS started to put forth the efforts on all the foreign assets that had any kind of a paper gain, unrealized capital gains. This person, called the Moore case, sued the Department of Justice and determined that this was unlawful, unconstitutional. June 20th, fast forward 2024, what happened? Supreme Court upholds it 7-2 as a constitutionally okay, no problem, put that thing to the test, and well, they passed it. In other words, the Supreme Court said that's constitutional. So now, fast forward again, Kamala Harris and the White House and the Biden administration has determined that the validity of this law stands and that it's not just about foreign assets, but because the decision was not narrowed and the scope was very wide, in other words, it was very broad in the decision, it allowed the White House to interpret it as a tax on all assets owned by Americans, even here in the United States. This is a 25% tax on unrealized capital gains. What this means is that if you have $100 million or more, and let me make one point here, there is no floor to this tax. See, the tax that came in as part of the Moore case was $10,000. So the $100 million that the Biden administration or Kamala Harris is talking about, it's an arbitrary number. And the reason they use the $100 million is it doesn't scare people. Only 2,600 people in America, or approximately thereof, will qualify. Now, you're not going to have civil unrest with 2,600 people. It's just not going to happen because 99.9% of America will be unaffected, they think. This tax, if it's enforced, she doesn't want to just make it an annual or a one-time tax. She wants to put an annual tax of 25% on unrealized capital gains. The detrimental effects on this would be an absolute catastrophe for the economy.
Christian, explain that. Explain the detrimental effects. Explain why this is so controversial. You told me that you did an hour-and-a-half show on this, and it just blew up on your podcast and your show. Why is this so controversial?
Okay, so if you take family offices, which is now basically the wealth of a family that's been reorganized as a business entity, and you look at some of the top family offices, you've got Bill Gates, you've got Berkshire Hathaway, which goes all the way to Warren Buffett, and then you've got smaller ones. The value of some of those assets have been gained over the last 30, 40 years, whether it's stock, like equities, whether it's bonds, even some of the bonds, which obviously are volatile, have gone back up. But the big thing is real estate. Real estate portfolio has been built on, in some cases, generational wealth, okay? So if you start to tax that and they don't have the liquidity, you're going to have trillions of dollars in equities, bonds, and real estate hit the market at the same time. In fact, there was an article last week that me and my team, what we were able to do was to take that article and then dissect how much of the detrimental effect would be actually felt from the top to the bottom. What we determined was you'd have literally between $5 and $10 trillion worth of assets that have to be sold in order to meet the demand, or at least the piece of this law that's going to be required. And technically, it is a law. It is in effect because they did send people bills that had foreign gains on their assets. So the effects is going to be felt at the top. But like any tax, anytime the top is taxed in such a heavy way, and this being the heaviest in history, it will flow down to the middle class.
All right, so now we're talking about these two candidates and their economic policy. I mean, obviously Kamala Harris has talked about other economic policies, about the child tax credit, help for new home buyers. I want to look at Trump now. I just reviewed some of his policies on his website. Key to his economic policy is making the Trump tax cuts that he implemented during his presidency permanent. I'm wondering if you can compare and contrast the impact of Trump's policy ideas with the Harris policy we just talked about.
Great question. Let's dissect that real quick. You look at Europe. The standard of which the tax system over there works, whether it's from the middle class, upper class, to a wealth tax like they have in Norway, has been detrimental on any kind of real world growth. If you look at Europe as a whole, just today I was looking at some numbers, and in the last 15 years, adjusted for inflation, Europe has not grown. Their tax system is so, I don't want to say the word absurd, but it's so abusive to the prosperity of the understanding that a small business needs as much cash flow, and of that cash flow, whatever those profits may be, they need to make sure that in most cases, is reinvested in the business. If the tax rates are substantially high, the money doesn't go to the business, it goes to the government. And usually that's put into social programs. Social programs are not growth applications in an economy. They do not grow an economy, they actually whittle it down. It makes people less aggressive or successful within any environment. So if Donald Trump cuts taxes and makes the taxes we have today more permanent and longer term instead of expiring next year, they'll actually grow the GDP. Kamala Harris's taxes are very similar, or at least her policy is, to Europe. If the standardized system of Europe is applied over here, the GDP will contract within 2 to 3 years. We'll actually have long-term recessions. Some of the things that we look at in with my team is policy. The policy right now of Kamala Harris would actually put us into a negative GDP for at least a decade if she was to get everything through, and it would be very detrimental and probably wipe out a third to a half of all the small businesses in America.
Now, I want to piggyback off of Chris's idea of comparing policies between the two parties, but move more towards government spending. So how do you foresee after the election, no matter which party wins, how do you see either party handling government spending, and how would the spending impact the economy?
That's a great question again. I don't see any one of them stop spending. I don't see it. Let me tell you why. This year, we're going to have about a $4.7 trillion in the fiscal 25-26 year. We're going to have 4.7, maybe $4.8 trillion in top line revenue for the federal government. We're going to be spending close to 6.8 to 7 trillion, even without looking at the 10-year and adjusting for a much larger amount of interest on the debt, but it will perpetuate itself. So when you start to think about what we're looking at, we actually have a declining GDP model. By 2028, 29, unless we cut spending, the GDP by itself will be so top-loaded in interest rate payments on the debt that the GDP will start to falter. So it is an imperative that they cut spending. I don't think they can do it the first year because you've got to get bipartisan support. I don't think if Trump wins, he'll win the Congress, or Kamala, that matters. So there's going to be some understanding they're going to come together. But I'm not so sure the two teams and the two parties will work together. And if not, by 28, we could see default on the treasuries.
And how do you propose they cut this spending?
They're literally going to have to cut the programs. I mean, you got to cut the programs because you got to look at, like any business, you got line items. Okay, each line item represents an outgoing revenue on a specific topic or a specific task, as we say. So if you're not getting the return on the investment, the equity of which that you're placing on that, you're going to have to cut it. You're going to have to reduce spending in places that doesn't have a real world gain back into the economy. That's just the way it is. And those programs are going to be tough. Those programs are going to be entitlements. You can't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. Those are going to be off. Where are you going to cut it? Could be, what, military? There's no way. There's no way they're going to cut military. Let's keep going down the line. I don't see where they can cut it, but they're going to have to. So if they don't do it, and they don't do it properly, by 28, late 27, 28, we will start to crack and start to default on the United States debt.
All right, Christian Briggs, thank you so much for that. I think it's startling how much debt there is, and I think this is something there's bipartisan concern about in American people. I mean, if I managed my money the way the federal government manages its debt, I would have a lot of credit card debt. Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.